Chapter 4. Chum. When Ralph awoke, the camp was dark. Crickets chirped in the weeds outside the craft shop. In the distance, frogs croaked, were suddenly silent, and croaked again. Timidly, Ralph began to investigate his new home. Someone had supplied him with food and water. A piece of paper had been dropped thoughtfully in one corner. Knowing that he was safe from the cat, Ralph nibbled at some of the dry corn and a lettuce leaf until his stomach was full. Then he shredded the paper, which was somewhat harder to chew than the Kleenex he had enjoyed at the Mountain View Inn, and spread it around his cage before he summoned enough courage to explore his exercise wheel. Ralph climbed cautiously onto the wheel, which swung back and forth so alarmingly that he jumped off. He ran around his cage, examining the wheel from every angle, deciding that the worst that could happen to him was falling off. Ralph tried again. This time he stayed on the wheel, and when he became accustomed to the swinging motion, he tried a few cautious steps. The wheel spun pleasantly beneath his feet. Ralph ran faster. The wheel increased its speed. Ralph raced as hard as he could run and then stopped. To his astonishment, the wheel continued to spin, and Ralph was carried completely around the circle so that for an instant before he began his descent, he was upside down at the top of the wheel. This ride was fun. When Ralph had coasted to a stop, he began to run again so he could spin around the full circle once more. Round and round went Ralph as the shadows in the crafts shop faded. Spinning on a wheel was as dangerous and as exciting as riding a motorcycle. His motorcycle. Ralph leaped from the wheel to the side of the cage nearest the window. The rays of the rising sun slanted through the bamboo, but no matter how hard Ralph strained his eyes, he could not catch even a glimpse of chrome or red metal. If only he had some way of knowing his motorcycle was still beneath the bamboo husk. An alarm clock went off in a lodge nearby, and a boy in rumpled pajamas stumbled out to blow the rousing bugle notes that brought the camp to life. Ralph busied himself scattering his shredded paper about his cage, nibbling his food, and racing on his wheel. While the campers were in the dining hall eating breakfast, Garth slipped into the craft shop, checked on Ralph's food and water, and slipped out again so quickly that Ralph only had begun to summon his courage to speak. That's funny, Ralph thought. The boy acts as if he's doing something wrong. After breakfast, Aunt Jill and several boys and girls straggled into the craft shop and settled down to make pictures by gluing dried rice, peas, beans, and corn to scraps of plywood. Mosaics, they called them. Such a waste of good food, thought Ralph, recalling some of the hard times he had gone through with his family back at the Mountain View Inn. Those campers were ruining enough food to keep a mouse family healthy for weeks. Before long, the mosaic makers discovered Ralph, who obliged them by racing on his loop the loop, said a boy named Pete. Isn't he a darling? Cried a girl. Apparently all girls called mice, at least mice in cages, darling. Ralph could not resist showing off by looping the loop once more, and when many hands pushed bits of the mosaics into his cage, he nibbled greedily. At least there was no scrounging at Happy Acres Camp. The next time Garth slipped into the craft shop while everyone else was in the dining hall, Ralph gathered his courage to speak. Say, he began in a timid voice, but the boy must not have heard, because at that moment he began to sing uncertainly to himself. Little rabbit frou frou, hopping through the forest, scooping up the field mice and banging them on the head. Ralph was stunned by the words Garf sang. What kind of boy would sing such a wicked song? Certainly not a boy a mouse could trust. Frightened and disappointed, he scuttled to the farthest corner of his cage and turned his back. Down came the good fairy, and she said, Little rabbit frou frou, I don't want you hopping through the forest, scooping up the field mice and banging them on the head. As Ralph sat trembling in his corner, he listened and was puzzled. Garth, with obvious pleasure, was singing the same words the campers were singing in the dining hall, but the tune was different. When their voices went up, Garth's went down. When their voices went down, Garth's went up. Sometimes his voice did neither, but wavered someplace in the middle. Ralph was bitterly disappointed by the whole turn of events. Garth was not interested in speed and motorcycles. He was interested in singing and banging field mice on the head. The hot summer days droned on. Ralph was supplied with more food than he could possibly eat, and his exercise wheel kept him in trim. Whenever Katso sneaked into the craft shop and showed an interest in Ralph's cage, someone snatched him and shoved him out the door. Life was safe, comfortable, and not unpleasant. From his cage near the window, Ralph had a good view of the camp. To the left, through the bamboo, he could see the boys' lodges. To the right were the girls' lodges. Before him lay the dining hall, the camp office, and a trampoline, a swimming pool, and a circle of benches in old school desks in front of a platform that held a piano. Off to the right, beyond the shade of the walnut trees, a pasture shimmered in the summer heat. Counselors who were college students, like the summer help at the Mountain View Inn, led the activities of the campers, and one counselor lived in each lodge with 8 or 10 campers. Ralph always found something interesting to watch. Campers spreading their sleeping bags out in the sun to air, counselors leading singing and directing skits around the campfire in the evening, boys racing to be first, in line when the bell was rung to announce meals, boys and girls in cowboy boots or English riding boots going off toward the barn for riding lessons. Boys and girls played and kittens romped under the walnut trees. Katso discovered a small hole in the craft shop's rusty screen door, which he explored with a paw as if it were a mouse hole. But faithfully, old Sam always arrived to tell him to move on. Never once did Garth forget to care for Ralph, and when he was not singing in his strange voice, he sometimes spoke. "Hi, little fella," he would say as he quickly detached the water bottle from the cage and refilled it at the sink. He even offered Ralph a sunflower seed with his fingers. Ralph was so lonely he was tempted to accept the seed for the sake of companionship. Then he remembered the song about mice getting banged on the head and retreated to the corner of his cage. One afternoon, when Ralph was particularly lonely, he decided that a boy who fed a mouse 3 times a day could not be so bad after all, and that the next time a sunflower seed was offered, he would venture out and accept it from the boy's fingers. However, when Garth finally came, he began to sing again. This time the song was different from the one the campers were singing over in the dining hall. It provoked Ralph's curiosity because he had heard others sing it, but had been unable to catch the words. The campers never sang this song when Aunt Jill was around, which made Ralph even more curious about the words. He was under the impression that they were not fit for grown-up ears, which, of course, made the song all the more interesting. Garth sang, and Ralph listened. Great green gobs of greasy, grimy gopher guts, stimulated monkey feet, chopped up baby parakeet. That was enough for Ralph. In his haste to hide, he bumped into the spout of his water bottle and flooded one side of his cage. He found refuge behind a lettuce leaf, where he sat trembling with nerves and fright while he refused to listen to another word of that fearsome song. Why, the next line might be about mice. Ralph stayed hidden behind the leaf for a long, long time. He was now uncertain that there was no he was now certain that there was no hope of ever communicating with Garth. Chopped up baby parakeet. Garth actually relished the dreadful words. Then one day, not long after Ralph had concluded that he was doomed to loneliness, a freckled-faced girl, wearing a baggy sweatshirt, shorts, and cowboy boots, came into the craft shop carrying a cage at least 10 times the size of Ralph's cage. She set it on the table in the nature corner. "Hi, Aunt Jill. I'm back. And here's Chum again," she announced. "I brought his box of food and bag of cedar shavings." Aunt Jill dropped the strands of the lanyard she was demonstrating to hug the girl. "Well, hi, Lana. Welcome back. It's good to see you again. Chum will have a friend this year. A mouse one of the new boys caught in a butterfly net." She lifted the big cage onto the shelf beside Ralph's cage. Ralph sat on his wheel to get a better look at the new occupant of the nature corner, a cranky-looking animal with tan and white fur. Ralph, who had never seen such an animal, watched silently while the creature, whatever it was, shoved and pushed and stomped at the cedar shavings in his cage. He seemed to have difficulty arranging them to his satisfaction. Next he went through his food dish, picked out a number of small green pellets, and shoved them outside his cage. The cedar shavings still did not please him, so he went back to shoving, pushing, and stomping. From time to time he paused to gnaw noisily at the bars of his cage with his long, curving teeth. Finally, when the bell had rung and the campers had gone off for their new meal, Ralph, in his eagerness for companionship, could no longer remain silent. "What are you, anyway?" he asked. "Some kind of fancy gopher?" The animal spat out a green pellet out of his cage before he shot Ralph a withering look of scorn. "Fancy gopher, indeed," he sniffed. "Well," Ralph faltered, "I didn't know. You can't blame me for asking." "I'm a hamster," said the animal, "a golden hamster. I am clean, odorless, and alert." "You don't look gold to me," said Ralph. "You look tan and hairy." At that response, the hamster turned his back on the mouse. Ralph nibbled a kernel of corn before he made up his mind to try again. "Pretty nice place we have here," he remarked. "Plenty of food and water. Interesting things to watch." The hamster climbed on his exercise wheel, and sat swinging to and fro while he stared at Ralph. When Chum remained silent, Ralph continued, "It's safe from the cat, too." Chum appeared never to blink his eyes. "Maybe," he said. Ralph's whiskers trembled. That one word spoken by the hamster hinted at evils unknown to Ralph. Here was an animal who was wise in the ways of the world. "Well, go on," thought Ralph impatiently. "Tell me more." Chum was silent. Finally, Ralph was forced to say, "How come that girl brought you here to Happy Acres?" "It's a long story," said Chum. "I'm not in any hurry," said Ralph. "Go on." Chum spat the hull of a sunflower seed into the bottom of his cage. "I am one of 13 hamsters, 6 girls and 7 boys, born in the back room of a pet store." 13! Ralph was awed. That's bigger than my litter. What was it like living in a pet store? We had a happy, carefree childhood there in the cage in the back room, Chum continued. There was plenty of food and water and fresh cedar shavings in the bottom of the cage. We slept all day, all 13 of us, in a warm and cozy heap. Then at night, as we grew older, we would play. Oh, the fun we had those nights in the pet shop. Chum paused, a faraway look in his eyes. Go on, urged Ralph. Where was I? Asked Chum. Oh, yes, the frolics we had at night. And then, Chum's voice shook with emotion. Ralph waited quietly until the hamster was able to continue. One day I was sound asleep in the corner of the cage. By then we had grown a lot, and I was on the bottom of the heap. But I didn't feel squashed. I felt safe and cozy there beneath my brothers and sisters when suddenly Chum stopped, unable to go on. Don't stop now, pleaded Ralph. What happened? A great human hand, a hand that smelled of dog. Ralph shuddered, reached in and picked up several of my brothers and sisters. Let me tell you, that woke us all up in a hurry. We were terrified. We scrambled around trying to hide behind our mother, under the wheel, in some cedar shavings, any place. I was slower than the rest, because you see, I was cramped from being slept on by brothers and sisters. And so the hand that terribly doggy hand got me. It didn't matter. That hand got all us youngsters and turned us upside down in the most undignified fashion. And then we were put into two cages, boys in one and girls in another. What for? Asked Ralph. Don't rush me, said Chum, picking up a sunflower seed in his paws and cracking it with his teeth. When he had eaten the kernels, he continued. Let me tell you, it was a terribly terrible shock. Shortly after, the doggy hand picked up our cage and loaded it into what is called a station wagon. I know. Ralph was eager to show off his knowledge. I used to see them in the parking lot outside the hotel. They were always full of children and luggage and sometimes a dog or two. Chum ignored the interruption. We soon found ours was not the only cage to go into the station wagon. Our sisters were loaded in beside us, along with a box of turtles, a cage of rather downhearted canaries, and two large cages, one containing puppies and the other some very silly kittens. Oh, yes, and a cage of white mice. White mice? Said Ralph scornfully. Anybody, not just owls, could see white mice in the dark. Then the man with the doggy smelling hands climbed into the front seat along with his wife, and we were off. Where to? Asked Ralph. The country fair, answered Chum. And it was a terrible trip. Kittens mewed, puppies whimpered, turtles scrabbled around in their boxes. What's a country fair? Interrupted Ralph. A noisy place, said Chum. It's full of people yelling, children laughing and shrieking, machinery that whirls and spins and plays music, all sorts of animals that neigh and moo and baa. It was hot and dusty, and our cages were set out in a booth. By the time we hamsters were exhausted. By that time, we hamsters were exhausted. It had been light for several hours, and we hadn't had a wink of sleep. I know what you mean, said Ralph with that feeling. That was only the beginning, continued Chum. A steady stream of people, mostly children, passed our cages, big, little, most of them sticky, and all of them noisy. Look, Mommy, look, Daddy, look at the darling little hamsters. I want one. Daddy, buy me a hamster. All morning long, parents were better. All morning long, parents were better. Don't be silly. Of course you can't have a hamster. You didn't take care of the last hamster you had. Come along. We don't have time to look at hamsters. Then a whole busload of children, all of them wearing white t-shirts with the letters across the front. Camp t-shirts? Interrupted Ralph knowledgeably from Happy Acres. Came crowding around the booth. They didn't have any parents with them, so they bought pets. You? Asked Ralph. Me, said Chum. I was bought by that grubby girl with freckles. To make a long story short, the doggy hands stuffed me into a hot little cardboard box with a few so-called air holes poked into it, and I spent the rest of the day being jossed around, peeked at, and fed little bits of caramel corn. Sounds good, said Ralph. Maybe to a mouse. There was a touch of scorn in Chum's voice. We rode in a bus to this camp, where a counselor put together a makeshift cage out of a bucket with a piece of screen bent over the top. After a few days, the girl's family arrived. There was quite a fuss when the parents saw that their daughter owned a hamster. But her two little brothers set up such a howl that once more I was stuffed into a box with so-called air holes, and after more bouncing and jouncing, I arrived at the family's house where I was put into this cage, where I have lived ever since, poked at with pencils whenever the children's horrid little friends came over to play, fed hamster food full of nasty little alfalfa pellets that I keep shoving out of my cage. You'd think they would catch on after a while, but no, they just keep on feeding me food mixed with alfalfa pellets. The worst part of my life is that I never get a full day's sleep. Someone always moving the cage to dust, rattling something against the bars, running the vacuum cleaner, practicing violin lessons. It's not an easy life, let me tell you. But how did you get back to camp? Ralph wanted to know. Last year, when Lana was packing her duffel bag for camp, her mother said that since the people who ran the camp had let her buy me, they could put up with me for 2 weeks. She was tired of reminding Lana to feed me. Last year, when Lana was packing her duffel bag for camp, her mother said that since the people who ran the camp had let her buy me, they could put up with me for 2 weeks. She was tired of reminding Lana to feed me and clean my cage, and she wanted a vacation herself. She said the same thing this year, so here I am for the third time. Oh well, at least it's a change and nobody runs a vacuum cleaner or practices the violin near my cage. Ralph was silent. Chum had given him a lot to think about. Like Chum, he sat swinging to and fro on his wheel, swinging and thinking, and as he swung and thought, something caught his eye. It was the striped forepaw of Catso. Reaching through the hole in the rusty screen door, Ralph watched in frightened fascination. The screen bulged from the pressure of Catso's shoulder as the paw groped and searched. The rusted screen stretched, and the evil paw, with its claw unsheathed, reached further into the craft shop. Where's Sam? Thought Ralph in terror. Why isn't that watchdog watching? The paw withdrew, and Catso's face pressed into the hole. His evil green eyes searched the craft shop. Ralph shrank into a ball in the farthest corner of his cage until he heard the short bark from Sam and summoned his courage to look around. Katzel was gone, but the hole in the rusty screen remained.